So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another episode of Backroads Arizona. In this video, I'm actually going to be working on my 2019 Velocity Turbo S Polaris XP4 Razor. I had the brake switch starting to get a little finicky, where I would have to stomp on the brake pedal several times to get the vehicle to start. And what I ended up finding was a bad brake switch, and I'm going to show you how to replace it. Now keep in mind, there's other things that can keep your Razor from starting, including wiring issues or a bad starter. But this one is specific to the fact that you have to stomp on the brake pedal to get it to start. So that pretty much narrows it down to the brake switch. So let's get to it. So when everything's working correctly on this Razor, you have to have the vehicle in park, obviously, and step on the brake in order to crank and start the engine. However, in my case, the last trip we went on, I was having to stomp on the brake pedal several times in order to get the vehicle to crank. This is an indication that the brake switch on the master cylinder is starting to go bad. A good way to check this, if you have another person, is to have them stand at the back of the vehicle and sit in the driver's seat and step on the brake. See if the vehicle cranks. If it does not crank, have them tell you whether the brake lights are on. If the brake lights are not on, then the most likely cause is going to be a faulty brake switch. Then try stomping on that brake pedal really hard a couple times and see if the brake lights do come on. And if it starts after that, then you definitely have a bad brake switch. So I ended up ordering my brake pressure switch off of Amazon. When ordering something off of Amazon, I usually don't go with the cheapest one, and I also don't go with the most expensive. I find one right in the middle that's rated good, and that's the one I ended up picking. I removed the hood from the Razor just to give me more light more than anything, because you can't really access the brake pressure switch from the top. You have to go from underneath. It's located on the other side of the master cylinder towards the front. It's the fitting that holds the two front brake lines to the master cylinder. Here's a view from the passenger side fender well. You can see the two brake lines towards the front of the master cylinder, and you can barely catch a glimpse of the brake switch, which is the fitting that holds those two lines to the master cylinder. This other brake line on the master cylinder is going towards the rear of the vehicle and then splits off for the two rear brakes. So a little FYI information here, in case you weren't aware, once you get down to a certain amount of brake fluid, the reservoir splits off into two separate chambers. One for the rear brakes, one for the front, and that way if you get a leak on one or the other, you don't lose all your brakes if you run out of fluid. So let's say, for example, if you're going through some brush and your front brake line gets caught on a branch and breaks it or severs it off, and you lose the fluid in that chamber, your rear chamber will still have fluid and you will still have rear brakes for safety reasons. So this is the bottom of the master cylinder, and the brake switch is right here. You can see the two lines that it's holding to the master cylinder. I unplugged the electrical from the brake pressure switch by lifting up the plastic tab and pulling the harness out of the switch. You do want to be careful with these pigtail ends, because over time they can get dry and brittle and break off. You will need a 7/8 wrench to break loose this brake pressure switch. I actually used a stubby wrench because it was much easier to get up in where this brake pressure switch is, because you're very tight on space. Once breaking it free, I was able to spin it loose by hand. I did have a bucket underneath me to catch any fluid that possibly would drip out, but barely anything came out of these lines. Once you get the pressure switch completely loosened off of the master cylinder, you will need to remove the 3 sealing washers and the 2 lines off of the brake pressure switch. The 3 sealing washers are all the same, so you don't have to worry about getting those mixed up. Right here you can see I'm removing the first washer, then the brake line, then the second sealing washer. Once getting the second sealing washer off, it was easier just to pull the brake switch off of the second brake line. Once removing the old brake switch from the vehicle, I compared it to the new one to make sure everything was identical, including the shaft size, the length, and the electrical pigtail connector. Once verifying that, I went in and took the final sealing washer off of the old brake switch and put it on the new one. The sealing washers are basically an aluminum washer with a rubber seal on the inside diameter of them. You want to make sure that rubber seal is in good shape, otherwise you might end up with a possible leak. Then I went in and put the new switch with the first sealing washer up and through the first brake line. Once getting it through that brake line, I took the second sealing washer and put it on the shaft of the switch, pushing it up to the first brake line, and then put the second brake line on. Once getting the second brake line in position and on the switch, I put that third sealing washer on and then started the brake pressure switch into the master cylinder by hand. I tightened it down as much as I could by hand and then used that 7/8 stubby wrench to finish snugging it down. You'll notice I'm using my hand to hold the brake line that's going over to the passenger side of the vehicle while I snug it down, because it will leverage up as you use the wrench to tighten it down. By doing this, I was able to keep it from rubbing other hoses and wiring harnesses when it was tightened down fully. So normally when you crack anything open on a brake system, you need to fully bleed the brakes. However, since I only lost a couple drops, what I ended up doing is, once I got everything tightened back down, I just barely pulsed the brake pedal several times. And since it only lost a couple drops, that little bit of air will bleed itself back up through the master cylinder by doing this. The only reason this is working to bleed this is because the lines that we took loose were right at the master cylinder. This will not work if you take a line loose down by one of the brake calipers. Now, if after doing this you still feel like you have a squishy pedal, or the pedal is not as hard as it was before doing the brake switch, then you might have to do a thorough brake bleed. In order to do this, you will want to make sure your master cylinder is topped off with oil, have somebody in the driver's seat. Now, in a normal brake bleed, you would start at the furthest caliper away from the master cylinder, which would be your right rear. However, since we only cracked the brake lines loose on the front brakes, that's all that we need to bleed. So we still want to bleed the caliper that's farthest away from the master cylinder, so we would do the right front first and then the left front. So you want to tell the person in the driver's seat to step on the brake and hold it. If the pedal is super soft, you can have them pump it up by pressing it a couple times and then holding it. Crack the bleeder on the caliper until no more pressure is coming out. Tighten the bleeder screw. Then you can tell them to release the brake. You will repeat that process until you work all the air out of the right front caliper, and then switch over and do the left front caliper. Make sure you don't run out of oil in the master cylinder during this process, otherwise you will push air into the system. Once you've fully bled those brakes, then you should be able to just barely step on that brake pedal and it should fire right up for you. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible, so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.